So before we begin, I'll also just do a quick bio for Dr. Cutts. So together with teams comprised of community partners, students, and myriad interdisciplinary collaborators, Dr. Cutts uses an environmental justice framework to guide scientific inquiry. Her research, teaching, and engagement aims to identify, center, and amplify human-nature relationships commonly overlooked or underestimated by narratives of resilience and sustainability in the US that implicitly or explicitly privilege and reinforce white supremacy and norms of cultural domination. Geospatial approaches to data, analytics, and visualization play an important role in efforts to represent and communicate the material legacies of discriminatory policies, as well as to identify opportunities to change policy programming and practice. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Bethany Cutts.
Great, thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here and super excited for the opportunity to talk a little bit about not just my research, but kind of the larger range of race and racism and other forms of othering that I think about in relationship to this. So it's a little strange to be the opening panelist on a series on race and place. As you might have noticed, I identify as a white woman, and the place of white women in racial politics of the United States in particular is at best problematic, right? Like the recent rise of the name Karen as a denigration of the ways white women tend to weaponize their place in society against people of other races is of particular prominence right now. So I wanted to start first by acknowledging that and the fact that I'm in a place of learning and process myself in terms of really coming to an authentic understanding of race as it relates to both my research, teaching, engagement, and just worldview overall. So this is a great opportunity to really learn in community and to open up dialogue and discussion with you all in order to do a better job meeting that mission that I shared with the grad students who organized this session. So I want to first take time to thank you all for inviting me to really speak with you. And I'm intentionally saying with you, right? This talk is unfinished. It's a work in progress. And it's an opportunity to create synthesis across activities that often seem disparate, and to create really a single framework that is evolving and that throughout this slideshow will link to different documents and opportunities to open up the systems and workflows that I've been using to really draw on how my scholarly work, approach to mentoring and teaching all interact with these ideas of race and place. So I'll end by talking about this current iteration of Just Technological Enough as an opportunity to bring community and university partnerships together to confront boundaries within academia, to authentic engagement with communities who exist in different relationships to ideas of white supremacy and white privilege, and to kind of talk through a little bit of the investigation that I've been doing into my own role and ways to resist these tendencies and kind of socializations within myself. So I want to throw out a list of authors that includes community partners, scholars, and students who have really been integral to my development as a thinker and to playing out both the geospatial and social relations, community relations, and project management tasks that go into making this all possible. So I've got kind of a few goals for this talk today, and hopefully the screen sharing shows it, but I've included a link for y'all. If you have any anonymous comments or questions, either about something I say that has the possibility of doing harm or perpetuating forms of injustice, racial or otherwise, as well as to ask for or provide opportunities for additional learning, engagement, and dialogue about these issues. So I encourage you to share whatever you want to in that section, as well as to be engaged in chat with one another and with me throughout this presentation. Now, I won't necessarily be able to answer all the chats because I can't see it while I'm giving the presentation, but I will make a point to come back to that at the end, and if not today, then certainly later. So my goal here is, taking my place as a non-trans or cisgendered heterosexual white woman working in academia from the place of privilege of having earned tenure recently, to really think about this question of race and place through a few different lenses. So first, I want to talk a little bit about how I'm answering this question: what is my place in research that centers race? Second, I'll talk about what is my place in research that centers race. And third, I'll talk more about how I contribute to research and action around race and place through these levels of self-awareness and reflexivity. So first, what is my place in research that centers race? Well, as I mentioned, I am white. And one thing in racial research that and research in general that often is under-acknowledged is the presence of whiteness. So as I've evolved from kind of a environmental scholar into definitely a social scientist working in environmental realms, the need to really take on and name whiteness has become one of the central and most prominent pieces that's transitioned my research over time. And I credit Betsy Breyer, a student I worked with at University of Illinois, a lot for discussions around these issues, looking at research, say, by white sociologists on Black men's experience in prison, and really examining how that scholar's work intersected in community and offended particular student groups, leading to practically some calls to rescind the hiring offer for that individual scholar, and philosophically to really examine the role of white women in particular in these racial spaces. So Betsy was looking for a job, right, and writing a dissertation about the kind of critical remote sensing approaches to understanding foreclosure crisis and changes in vegetation. And trying to find a way to do that was reflective of the longstanding imprint of racial segregation on urban landscapes, while also recognizing her positionality in this work. And I think that really opened up opportunities to name, reflect on, and examine whiteness in all sorts of places along the research trajectory, from who we work with and how we formulate questions, to the types of analysis techniques and tools we use, to the way we interpret and contextualize data. So her work, was not only useful to her, but also useful to me as we reflected on ways that individual socialization as particular identities, as embodied researchers, right, feeds into what we do, how we ask questions, and the intervention that it really makes in different spaces. And this kind of led me to deeper thought around a few different changes I could make in my research process. Already, we were working hand in hand with communities to identify relevant research questions and to pull in different tools from research that could be useful to those enterprises, and combining a range of qualitative and quantitative methods in order to do that across social science, geospatial science, and collaboration with natural scientists from different disciplines. But the other thing that at that point we started to untangle for ourselves by drawing on research from Black feminism, Indigenous scholars, and others, was overcoming deficits in our language. So to resist these deficit language in order to resist these savior languages, where by only achieving things that were in deficit in some places and in abundance in whiter, more affluent communities, could communities be complete. And this is something that's present in environmental justice literature across a range of geospatial approaches, as well as in social questionnaire research. Difference is not always deficit. And so finding language that moves away from these ideas in anthropology of deprivation, away from ideas in some definitions in leisure science of leisure as kind of a condition of affluence, privilege, and power, toward the free time that you have, the ways that you represent, and and opportunities for cultural pluralism over cultural supremacy. And so what I mean by that is there often are multiple socially constructed ways of being, and the ways that we negotiate cultural differences in either hierarchical or more excuse me, in either hierarchical or more networked and equal ways of relationships makes a difference. And it's not only the opportunity to question power relations, but perhaps an essential opportunity for scientists to do so. So, so the idea that I can fix a community is not one that I'm trying to unseat from my practice and writing in these community university partnerships. That's not the way I see my role in science. And so as an outsider, in almost all of my research cases, finding a better place where I'm amplifying voices of the community and providing opportunities to advance science by listening to those voices and the tensions between local knowledge and scientific knowledge, I think provides an opportunity to, one, be a lifelong learner myself, and two, to make real inroads in new areas of scientific inquiry. And over time, this has proven to be really exciting and successful, while also being really challenging. So by doing things like this in Milwaukee, we heard people talk about relationships to water, environment, and race, where both historically and in contemporary terms, rivers in the city of Milwaukee are dividing lines. They were set up that way historically by fur traders who were in competition with one another. And the roads and bridges mismatch their lines of segregation historically through the city's past. So talking to people in Milwaukee about the rivers really engaged deep discourses about race, about gentrification, and about social vulnerability. And these were consistent, but not completely contained within scientific ideas about how to map out differences in political empowerment or social vulnerability in the community. So by rethinking some of those indices, we could not only provide tools that were useful to watershed planners who are trying to understand these remediation projects that were doing river cleanups so that their community engagement was more successful, but we could also advance the science of social vulnerability indexing in some ways. So the second part of this Race and Place series got me really thinking about what is my place in research that centers race. And I mean, in a word, my place is NC State, like more than it's the communities I'm working with. NC State is literally my workplace. And I say that as a love letter and a mandate for rethinking how I work in all aspects of relation to the university in order to better create opportunities for students, staff, and faculty from diverse racial, ethnic backgrounds, as well as differences in gender identity and more, to be included and be able to use the parts of their experiences that are literally outside of how academia was constructed to advance inclusion and opportunity for knowledge growth. So simply put, my place is really to think about environmental flows and relationships that shape human and natural dynamics, and to rethink the way I do this, and the kind of recognition justice elements that began my research career in relation to both symbolism and their liberatory potential. So this comes with disrupting harmful impacts of conservation-based environmental thinking. Dorceta Taylor is an environmental sociologist and historian who's just written like magnificent books, very accessible books that talk about these things, that chasms between conservation, public health, and occupational health, along with these ideas of cultural supremacy, have served to make the environment, environmental protection, and wilderness often tools of discourses of dispossession, and sometimes going as far as eco-authoritarianism. This has had implications for conservation and development worldwide. And thinking about Dorceta Taylor's work, I've come to understand the university as an actor in these systems, in terms of not only how we educate students and what we deem appropriate and important material to convey to them, but also in terms of things like financial links of the university, the way as a land grant university, right, this site is founded on actual land that dispossessed indigenous groups historically, and that continues to marginalize and ignore indigenous relationships to the world, to the earth. It also comes, at the cost of indigenous groups in other places of the world. So you may have seen maps in the Chronicle for Higher Education and other places that look, for example, at land holdings of all of the land grant institutions established under the Morrill Act, and seen that this wealth accumulation came by gifting universities lands in the West that had been promised to different indigenous groups, and so on. So thinking about that, both in context of the university and getting our students and ourselves to acknowledge that, if not in a formal land acknowledgement, which sometimes is problematic because of a tendency to historicize indigenous groups, and in a place like North Carolina, where we have so many vibrant indigenous communities throughout the state. I think 25 state recognized tribes. I don't quote me on the number, but that this historicization is a disservice to the continued learning and activism that indigenous groups are leading, especially in my field of environmental justice, and in things, projects like water protection and pipeline resistance. So our future to beyond fossil fuel energy source is really rooted in resisting cultural supremacy that has marginalized and created opportunity for mass genocide and erasure of indigenous groups, rather than support of that. And I'm wrestling now, with how to do that in research when data from the perspective of geospatial approaches is often organized in ways that themselves can be actors in continuing that erasure. So, you're working with political systems and data that's, say, organized at a county or a state level, and that's just in conflict with ideas of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in and of itself. So how do we acknowledge the limitations of the tools we have when we're working with the groups who are potentially harmed by those very boundaries and tools of aggregation. So another part of this might be one of the more well-developed parts of this of this explanation, is to really rethink what interdisciplinary scholarship, especially in the environment, needs to look like in a university in order to better support diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And this idea kind of comes from a few tensions I've experienced over time at different institutions, but also from widespread use of the metaphor of a T as a good model for interdisciplinary training, right? Like you get students and well-trained in the tools and conventions of a particular discipline, and then they have aptitude so that they can reach out to other related disciplines in order to solve problems. But it makes sense to me that this is a problem from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective, because this assumes that the baseline, that the staff of the T is already in a good place, that this, and not a place that itself is embroiled in cultural supremacy, white supremacy, heteronormative, or kind of a masculinist culture. So Andy Fox at the Geospatial Forum last week talked about some beautiful examples of working with communities to overcome some of these tensions and to leverage the skills and opportunities within academia and academic disciplines, but not so much through a T as what I would say is more a J-shaped interdisciplinary approach, where students are sliding along to find their interest, identify problems that are of interest and use to them, and then using the skills and knowledge of their advisors, of their, what I like to call friendtors, other students with similar but not identical interests, to really find and draw together the skills and experiences from conventional academia to explore and explore tensions and use these tensions and conflicts as a way to build new knowledge that serves diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in ways that conventional disciplines have often ignored. So this approach to accounting and benchmarking, this approach is in conflict with ways universities have conventionally thought about accounting and benchmarking, and it's damaging, I think, to ideals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, but also to ideals of usable and useful knowledge. In order to advance society, especially in the US, where we have a history of indigenous genocide and racist capitalism at the formation of the nation, there may be a need not just to continue to build toward things, but to really, what a former student of mine has called compost. Jordan Williams talks about, compost as a way of reorganizing resources so that something new can come about. It's not wasted. The time and energy is not wasted, but this deeper level of reorganization may be necessary. So finally, how do I contribute to research and action? How do you use deep reflection and resistance to and observations of systems that are incomplete and unjust in order to use scholarship as a opportunity for justice? So first, I would say is to recognize that all action in science is political in some way or another, and the inaction itself, right, is an act of legitimacy for particular cultural supremacy, particular acts of cultural supremacy. And so my contribution to research and action is one of many pathways that I think white identifying men or women or gender nonconforming folks can use to really incorporate race and racism into their research. And so for me, this is by looking at vulnerability, partnership, power, conflict intention, and abundance. So I've been working, and not always succeeding, at putting these into practice in an ongoing research partnership in Robeson County, North Carolina, where we're looking at disaster recovery after hurricanes. If you went to the Geospatial Forum last Friday, you might recall is also the area where Andy Fox is working. Ryan Emanuel has done a significant amount of work with the Lumbee population, and the seat of Lumbee governance is in Robeson County. There are researchers far and wide working in this area, and it gives pause, right? How can we make sure that, or can we make sure that this information and approach is not extractive, or is at least taking advantage of as many opportunities to not just waste or spend resources in community, but to really invest, that the energy community members are putting into filling out surveys, participating in water sampling, is paying back to them and paying forward at larger scales in terms of potential policy changes. So this started at a lot smaller scale, that using the community voice framework, which is a framework developed by urban planners from University of North Carolina, in which you start with working with community members to identify opportunities where research could potentially be beneficial, getting to know community, collecting data, organizing data, creating community-facing data products and visualizations, and finally synthesizing these into deliberative documentaries. So this means that data collection and research processes have a few differences between the ways we tend to think about social science centered data collection and geospatial approaches. And the first is that when we give people the option, but when they choose it, we video and audio record all of the interviews with the idea that we will share this publicly. This gives us a direct give back to the individual in the form of an oral history where they've shared their experience and can then share that with their family or friends. But it also gives us an opportunity to examine dialogue and discourse by constructing this video and showing it back to people. And what we've found, and others who've used this approach have found, that a couple of things come out of that. One is the opportunity to identify lots of community needs that you didn't necessarily anticipate going forward. And when you're dealing with actively evolving circumstances like hurricane recovery in the context of another hurricane and COVID, this is pretty useful in terms of being able to use your grant writing skills to help community and to identify other skills and assemblages of research expertise that might be useful and usable beyond those you hold yourself. The other thing it does is construct dialogues from people who might not be able to hear one another and might not be able to listen to one another. And what I mean by that is space and time and personalities and deep tensions can conflate and confuse focus groups, community meetings, and the like. So by having a video, you can first capture people where they are, people who are elders and may have physical mobility issues that make it difficult for them to get to a particular location, people raising children who aren't able to go between the hours of 5 and 9 or whenever they're holding community events. And by bringing those voices together, the second thing you can do is give people an object to critique instead of a person. So we use the research skills to synthesize different perspectives and to try to identify clips where people are representing not necessarily the most common opinion, but the diversity of opinions within a community. And by having those opinions represented in a format that's not another person sitting in front of you, we've found that people are more open to broader community level discussions and come up with some pretty creative opportunities to overcome that what typically are barriers. And so in work where there's opportunities for mistrust or distrust between government agencies and in this case hurricane survivors, confusion about the actions that might be going on at the city level to say buy out particular properties, by taking in this case working in a rural community where people have long histories of going to high school with one another, taking the video and taking the researcher's external perspective and using that very intentionally to reflect back what you're hearing and to change up maybe the person who's saying it. There's a lot of opportunity there for innovation and to use both visualizations and other geospatial tools to feed back to community or feed up to policymakers that community members might not have easy access or direct relations to. So as I mentioned, we started by doing a lot of community listening. In addition to our initial research question, which was focused on the idea that the emphasis on understanding how disaster recovery efforts intervene in social vulnerability and understanding how differences in local definitions of community resilience are work in the watershed, we found that there were lots of opportunities to provide an easy give back to community members in the form of soil testing. So in a few previous collaborations, I'd worked on some soil testing projects with environmental scientists. We were hearing again and again after Hurricane Matthew that people just weren't sure what had been deposited in their soils. So after Hurricane Florence in 2018, it was not appropriate for us to go ask people questions with the idea we just give them back a DVD of their recollection of how bad or not bad the hurricane was in terms of the damage that it did and what they expected or didn't expect from different levels of government or researchers like us. This soil testing result was a reasonably fast give back that we could provide, and it took advantage of the network of collaborators we had established for the project. So this network of collaborators included many community interview specialists who we hired specifically because of their diverse positions within the community and as community leaders. And we engaged in a mutual training at the beginning where the university team, including graduate students from a number of disciplines, worked with the community interview specialists to learn from their experiences. And we heard great things that allowed us to get beyond kind of the risk, I guess you could call it, of either tokenizing an individual or set of community advisors, or kind of over investing in their perspective on community. So in addition to our community advisors who had helped us set up the program and the research opportunity, these community interview specialists brought just tremendous knowledge as Lumbee people, as LGBT people, as former mayors, as people with complex and varied histories in the area, from a variety of age and age classes, racial backgrounds, and geographies within the county. It's just like the best. In addition to that, and the community advisory board, the second hurricane created a lot of need to reinvest my time in the community in a way that was kind of fun and would build trust. So attending meetings in the community, really working hard to kind of understand local racial politics, working hard to understand through the literature and other places why racial identity formation is a useful but incomplete way to understand indigenous groups like the Lumbee, and to just do fun things in the community, like set up a photo booth where I asked people to share their one-word version of their stories and give back a Polaroid to the person who participated, and have as a result kind of a better sense of the community words that researchers use that mean literally nothing when you're working with folks that are outside of a research mindset, to meet other researchers and to just realize how many research teams these people were helping. That, I joke about it now, but the people would say, what project is this for? Or whatever happened to the wristband study? And so both the level of investment and donation on the part of the community partners was really something to respect, and to look for ways to continue to invest in. That was hugely generous. And we tend to think about researchers as the ones with the power in these sorts of community dynamics, right? Whereas, researcher as client is something that discourse and the way we think about research seems to come more from like the idea like the benevolent patron. But here researcher was actually client as well. So thinking about that position in the community was humbling, as it should be, and really created an opportunity and a need to double down. So how did we make contributions, and where did geospatial stuff come in? Well, we worked along the way early on to develop some maps that we could share with people together with the MGIST students. So Nikita was one student. Gita Nakina was a student who helped develop a web application and user guide to just organize some different data sets that folks in the community were asking for, and to give us tools that we could then share with North Carolina volunteers after disaster at their annual meeting, as they work not only in Robeson County, but across the state. And that gave also a good opportunity for, again, one of these spin-off projects. So the VOADs wanted to share data on volunteer responses after a disaster, and now Byron Ifedora is working with that data as part of his dissertation, with the direct opportunity to inform how geospatial and spatial and temporal methods fit into how they examine their effectiveness, efficacy, and influence over equity across the state and potentially across the nation. So what else do we do? Well, this listening and this voice recording and the engagement with community interview specialists as equal partners, and not just as people rolling out a project, really has an opportunity to leverage their knowledge and community relations in a lot of different ways. And so Hannah Goins, for example, is Lumbee. She'd worked on she was a student at UNC Pembroke, and she was able to help us go beyond the usual suspects. And I mean the usual suspects in terms of interviews, participants in a couple different ways, right? Like one person we interviewed was the former Miss UNC Pembroke, who was LGBT Lumbee firefighter, and just deep, and in her early 20s. So deeply invested in community, but not in the social networks of our community advisors, and not someone our presence as a researchers from the outside were likely to appeal to or form trusting bonds with. So Hannah was just absolutely useful in that. We have developed a joke that, you know, if you want somebody to say yes to participating with us in this research, you have Hannah give them a call. This led to other data products like E. coli samples from across yards after Hurricane Matthew, and a need to really think about communication of the results in a way that was accurate but not stigmatizing. So unlike the heavy metals that we tested yards for, there are no federal regulations or guidelines on residential soils and acceptable levels of E. coli, and no real baselines on what you should or would consider safe based on the different sources. So we worked with the community CHHE, Katie May, I forgot what CHHE, Center for Human Health and the Environment, and learned a lot from what the PFAS researchers were doing to appropriately communicate their results. And one thing we came up with for Robeson County, which you can see if you go to our website, is to compare the range of E. coli values there from the range we got at NC State's campus. So by comparing to this place of privilege, we had a real opportunity to not make measurement itself an act of stigma. And the ranges were pretty much the same in terms of variability and maximum and minimum. And so that was a comfort to people that, you know, yes, they were worried about bacterial contaminants from sewer overflows and hog lagoons that may have spilled up a river, but that those, to some extent anyway, those concerns were diminished over time, and it was kind of like one less thing to worry about in terms of their overall recovery process. It also, by working with communities in these residential settings, we also had the opportunity to contribute to advancement and innovation for our colleague Angela Harris in civil and environmental engineering. So Angela worked a lot and continues to work a lot in bacterial systems and water contaminants. And by working with us to meet the community need or interest in soil testing, even though it's of low scientific value, people aren't really as interested in those cycling processes as they are in the water. It got us and her thinking a little bit more about these mixes of fecal bacteria and heavy metals, and looking at the literature that suggests there's some evidence that in the presence of heavy metals, antibiotic resistant bacteria tend to proliferate at a higher rate. And so this is a huge concern for landscapes with high amounts of animal agriculture, and where, you know, people are concerned about antibiotic resistance and the efficacy of antibiotics in both animal and human health. And so the ability to inform her work was also convenient because of COVID. She cannot, and Ebola, the work she usually does in I'm not going to remember, in developing nations. And I apologize, remember precisely where her work is, give, you know, another research stream that she could continue in the absence of those opportunities. So this opportunity and this is, I think, something that people often underplay, that there's opportunity even for non-engaged scholars to learn and innovate as a result of new ways of engaging. And this is kind of what I mean when I say J-centered interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work. And Angela's been just a fantastic collaborator on in all sorts of ways as a result of this project. So we also, provide maps of locations where we have done sampling with geographic screens to promote privacy at a level that makes sense for the administrative units that might be thinking about different restoration recovery events, opportunities for future collaboration with groups like the Coastal Dynamics and Design Lab, where they're thinking about recreation as mitigation. I think will be really productive, because what they're hearing and seeing from the city of Lumberton and the perspective of the community partners we're working with are very different and in tension with one another. And so can we solve these problems with maps? No, but we can use maps to help develop, like the videos, a common understanding and an opportunity to exchange information and evaluate alternative ways of understanding the same landscape. The other thing we can do is build this documentary, right? So to literally pass the mic to communities through documentary production, so that there are community-facing products and outcomes at every stage of the process, and that these aren't just going to the individuals who participated in the research, but have the opportunity to become part of larger community dialogues, both those that we're having in academia and those that are ongoing in the community. In this particular project, we've done over 80 interviews with about equal numbers of white, Indigenous, and Black residents in the county, and a handful of Latinx and Spanish-speaking residents. And that is roughly representative of the racial and demographic diversity within the county. A documentary with 80 people is quite unwieldy. So we've started with a focus group version of a documentary that's about 17 minutes long. That was a collaboration with our community interview specialist and research team here at NC State, as well as conversations with researchers at UNC Duke. And when I say UNC, I mean UNCP, UNC Chapel Hill, UNC Greensboro. And we're in the process of refining that so that we can use it for these next stages of development and opportunity to do what we realize is next, which is really develop these just technological enough approaches. So COVID has pointed out or highlighted the need for the research community to really readapt their cultural expectations of who has access to technology to the reality of different places. And together with Ryan, Emmanuel, Andy Fox, Angela Harris, and researchers at other locations and a range of community partners, we're really looking to figure out how to build an infrastructure that brings together research going on across so many different people and research teams across the nation and the world that center on Robeson County, so that those become investments in community resilience initiatives. Yeah, I don't know. It's a mess in all the best ways and all the most frustrating ways. But I think there's real opportunities to feature a wider range of scholars and scholarly views in all our courses, to think about the assets and power and strength that students bring to projects because of their particular backgrounds, and to encourage them to continue to educate themselves in cross-cultural communication and awareness, to create space for that to happen, to give people some time to read and some time to learn, and to find ways to honor the ways that these efforts are not proportionately distributed in the way our system is set up now. So for example, there's research to support, and I've seen in my own anecdotal experience that women and students of color, LGBT students, faculty, staff are doing lots of invisible labor to kind of keep people and projects going that are not necessarily or intentionally valued in the ways that academia props up kind of white supremacist and potentially racist policies and practices. So in order to create systems that value these contributions and opportunities for them, we need to, or I personally feel an obligation to hold spaces of white supremacy and white spaces more accountable, including within myself in terms of reading, engaging, and listening, and eating it big time. When people find opportunities to call me out on ways that white supremacy is still infiltrating my speaking and my engagement with students, to ask myself, am I really in community with people from a range of cultural backgrounds? These days, am I in community with anyone that don't live in this house? And then to continue to kind of just be comfortable being uncomfortable, for lack of any more useful way of saying that. And also to hold, to hold the idea that in spaces of inclusion, younger generations actually have quite a bit more to teach older generations in a lot of ways. Not in all ways, but in many ways. Like intergenerational learning in both directions, to piggyback on Catherine Stevenson's work, is so important in these areas of equity and justice, because younger people, less indoctrinated or undisciplined, or more undisciplined people, they have the freedom and to be creative and to ask questions about what is possible and not what is plausible. So I'm gonna zip it there. I've included, as I said this at the beginning, this is I don't know, some kind of manifesto in progress, as I really strive to figure out what are the strands that link my commitment to racial justice and scientific inquiry in a way that honors integration between research, teaching, service, and engagement. And yeah, I made a lot of, yeah, I think I'll stop there and take any questions, and also open the opportunity to discuss this or other ideas at any point in the future.
Thank you, Bethany. That was great. We have two questions in the chat, and it refers directly to your presentation. The first one was the book title. You talked about a book at the beginning during your section of your place in research that centers race. And the question was, can you share that book title? And I can type it in the chat too.
Oh, yes. Dorceta Taylor's book. Is that, I think that's the book. It's, yeah, I will put the Amazon link because that came to the top, but with the caveat, if you can find an independent bookstore, please go ahead and buy that. And Dorceta Taylor's been writing just really wonderful environmental justice scholarship for a really long time.
Okay, thank you. The second question we had, someone mentioned that the Vimeo video the link that you posted is private.
Yep.
So if there's a password that people could have, or if you'd rather people fill out your Google form, I'm not sure.
Yep, I'm happy to, I put it in the links to this presentation, and my intention was to share the presentation so that if folks have any that people can use it as a resource, click on all the links that I put in there, and then provide comments and that sort of thing. So the video is up in private. It's private because it's still in development. For example, there's a couple fact checking things we need to figure out in terms of how people talk about the watershed. But yeah, I'd be happy. And and if you just want to check out some of the videos, we have so one of our like little things that we're doing for community engagement is there's quite a bit more community activity on Facebook than other social media platforms. So to kind of start to share some of these videos and short clips from individual interviews where we have all the permissions to do so on the website there. So I'll share that in the chat right away, the Facebook link, which includes the link to our project website and some of the data that we've shared out with community. And we'll hold you over until I remember to share the link on the Vimeo.
Okay. I think we can do one more question. This is from Nikki. She said, thank you so much for all of this. Can you elaborate a little bit on land acknowledgements and where the thinking is going on them? Are there any ideas or alternatives to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nikki. I'm certainly not an expert on kind of thinking on land acknowledgement. I think the sentiment is, well, so for those who don't know, land acknowledgement is a statement where you kind of talk about the historic dispossession of indigenous groups on the land where you're speaking, and oftentimes also recognize the unpaid labor of enslaved peoples or ongoing like resource extraction of another kind as part of recognizing where you are. So NC State does not have a land acknowledgement statement, but several of the UNC system campuses do, and you can kind of see what those are. Dix Park recently did a land acknowledgement in collaboration with the Catawba Nation, I believe. So the general premise is to acknowledge that the United States is founded on genocide. And that acknowledging that is a first step in making progress. I think I'm seeing more kind of interest in land back movement, which is giving lands back to indigenous groups that are still that were not driven extinct, for lack of a better word, by settler colonialism in North Americas and in other European colonial settlements. But I don't know that there's a good, I think, it's contextual. I think doing a land acknowledgement just based on like those, the map of that the land, just doing it without thinking it through is a bad idea. I think that's where people are in thinking about that. So if it's intentional, if it's tied to some sort of resource commitment to indigenous groups that were displaced or that coexist in the location where the land acknowledgement is taking place, then I think that sort of authenticity is still valuable. But that just kind of like the window dressing approach as like a one and done is something that people are starting to see more of and resist.
Okay, well, thank you everyone. We're just over the hours. So I want to say thank you all for coming. Thank you again to Dr. Cutts for giving this first talk. And yeah, please join us for our next Race and Place seminar. It's going to be on the 22nd of February at 12 p.m. as well. And I'll send out a reminder email the week before. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much to GGSO for organizing and for including me. I'll stay to answer questions, any questions that folks have.